Welcome to Echoes of Stories, where timeless tales come alive with emotion, mystery, and meaning. Tonight, we journey back to the year 1757, when war raged between empires and tribes, and the forests of colonial America whispered stories of courage, betrayal, and love. Beneath the shadows of towering pines and the echoes of musket fire, two Mohican warriors and a white scout risked everything to protect the innocent. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of honor, sacrifice, and the fading heartbeat of a vanishing people. The Last of the Mohicans was penned by James Fenimore Cooper, one of the earliest voices in American literature. Born in 1789, Cooper brought the untamed wilderness to life through vivid storytelling and unforgettable characters. Published in 1826, this novel remains his most iconic work, a gripping blend of history, heroism, and heartbreak. Long before the birth of modern America, when the forest stretched endlessly across the land, powerful tribes ruled the wilderness, proud, brave, and deeply connected to nature. But with the arrival of European settlers, everything began to change. Wars broke out, territories shifted, and in that chaos, a few native tribes began to fade from the pages of history. Among them were the Mohicans, the people whose courage and spirit inspired this story. So settle in. Let the echoes of the past guide you through one of America's greatest epics. This is The Last of the Mohicans. In the colonial wars of North America, one striking feature stood out. Before opposing armies could clash, they first had to endure the harsh trials of the wilderness. Dense forests, seemingly impenetrable, stretched across the land, dividing the territories of France and England. These natural barriers demanded immense effort. Hardy colonists and seasoned European soldiers often spent months battling river rapids and navigating rugged mountain paths. Their goal was simple: reach the battlefield and prove their courage in open combat. Yet, through perseverance and by mirroring the endurance of native warriors, they adapted. Over time, no corner of the forest remained untouched. Even the darkest groves and the most serene hideaways became vulnerable. Those driven by vengeance or loyalty to distant European monarchs pressed forward, leaving no refuge untouched. Among all the frontier regions, few places captured the brutality of that savage warfare like the land between the headwaters of the Hudson River and the nearby lakes. This area bore witness to relentless conflict and fierce survival. Nature had carved out clear paths for movement. Lake Champlain stretched from the Canadian border deep into New York, offering a natural corridor for the French to advance. Toward its southern end, it merged with another lake, so pure that Jesuit missionaries chose it for sacred baptisms. They named it Deux Saints Sacrament. The English, less devout, renamed it after their reigning monarch from the House of Hanover. Together, these colonial powers stripped the native people of their right to preserve the lake's original name, Mohican. The sacred lake, nestled among countless islands and surrounded by mountains, stretched another dozen leagues to the south. At its southern edge, a high plain blocked the water's further flow. There, a portage began, spanning just as many miles, leading travelers to the banks of the Hudson River. At that point, despite the usual obstacles of rapids, or rifts as they were then called, the river became navigable all the way to the tide. While pursuing bold and disruptive strategies, the French even ventured into the remote and rugged gorges of the Allegheny Mountains. It was no surprise that their renowned sharpness would recognize the strategic value of this region. This very landscape became a brutal battleground, where many of the fiercest struggles for control of the colonies took place. Forts were built at key points along the route. These strongholds were captured and recaptured, destroyed and rebuilt, as the tide of victory shifted between opposing forces. as farmers retreated to the safety of older settlements, avoiding the perilous passes. Massive armies, larger than those that once decided the fate of European thrones, disappeared into the forests. Few returned. Those who did came back in skeletal ranks, worn down by hardship or crushed by defeat. Though peace had no place in this cursed land, its woods teemed with soldiers. The glens echoed with the beat of war drums, and the mountains returned the laughter and wild cries of young, spirited men, many of whom would soon vanish into the silence of death. It was in this very setting of violence and turmoil that the events of this story unfolded. They took place during the third year of the final war between England and France for control of a land that neither would ultimately keep. Britain's military leadership abroad had grown weak, and her government at home lacked resolve. This decline had tarnished the nation's once proud image, an image built by the brilliance of earlier warriors and statesmen. No longer feared by her enemies, Britain's representatives began to lose even their own self-respect. The colonists, though blameless in this downfall and too modest to influence such failures, still shared in the consequences. They had recently witnessed a devastating defeat. A hand-picked British army, sent from the very nation they revered as a mother and believed to be invincible, had been routed by a small force of French and native fighters. The army's only salvation came from the calm leadership of a young Virginian, whose later fame would spread across the world with the quiet force of moral greatness. This unexpected loss left the frontier exposed. Real dangers were soon joined by countless imagined ones. Fear spread like wildfire. Colonists believed they heard savage war cries in every gust of wind blowing from the endless western forests. The brutal reputation of their enemies only deepened the dread. Recent massacres haunted their memories. No ear was too deaf to hear the chilling tales of midnight slaughter, where forest natives played the role of ruthless executioners. As anxious travelers shared their harrowing stories, the timid grew pale with fear. Mothers, even in the safety of large towns, watched their sleeping children with unease. Fear began to overpower reason. Men who should have stood firm gave in to panic. Even the bravest began to doubt the outcome of the war. And with each passing hour, more joined the ranks of those who believed that all of Britain's American holdings would soon fall, either to their Christian enemies or to the merciless hands of their savage allies. News arrived at the fort guarding the southern end of the portage between the Hudson River and the lakes. It was said that Montcalm had been seen advancing up Lake Champlain with an army numerous as the leaves on the trees. The report was accepted not with the bold eagerness of warriors ready for battle, but with the hesitant fear of men unsure of their strength. The message came late in the day, carried by a swift Indian runner. He also brought an urgent plea from Munro, the commander stationed at the Holy Lake, requesting immediate and strong reinforcements. The distance between the two forts was less than 5 leagues. Originally connected by a narrow forest trail, the path had since been widened to allow wagons. What the native runner had covered in 2 hours could now be crossed by troops and their supplies within a single summer day. The British had named these two strongholds Fort William Henry and Fort Edward, honoring favored princes of the ruling family. Munro, a seasoned Scottish officer, held the first with a small force of regulars and a few provincial soldiers, far too few to stand against Montcalm's advancing army. At Fort Edward, General Webb commanded over 5,000 men. By combining his detachments, he could have fielded nearly twice that number against the French, who had ventured far from their own reinforcements. Yet, weighed down by their declining fortunes, both officers and soldiers seemed more inclined to wait behind their defenses than to strike first. They did not follow the bold example set by the French at Fort Duquesne, who had attacked during their enemy's advance. As the initial shock of the news faded, a rumor spread through the camp along the Hudson's edge. It was said that a select group of 1,500 men would march at dawn toward Fort William Henry. The rumor quickly became fact. Orders were issued from the commander-in-chief to the chosen units, instructing them to prepare for departure. Webb's intentions were now clear. The camp buzzed with hurried steps and anxious expressions. Young soldiers, new to war, rushed about in confusion, slowing their own progress with frantic energy. Meanwhile, experienced veterans moved with calm precision, hiding their unease behind measured actions and quiet resolve. Though they showed no outward panic, their eyes betrayed a deep concern for the unfamiliar dangers ahead. As the sun set behind the western hills, golden light bathed the camp. Gradually, the sounds of preparation faded. The last glow disappeared from the cabin windows. Trees cast long shadows over the earthworks and the rippling stream. Silence settled over the camp, as deep and still as the surrounding forest. At dawn, the army's sleep was broken by the roll of drums. Their echoes traveled through every wooded path, carried by the damp morning air. Slowly, the outlines of tall pines emerged against the soft, cloudless sky. The camp stirred to life. Even the lowest-ranked soldier rose to witness the departure and feel the pulse of the moment. The chosen troops assembled quickly. The king's regulars took their place on the right, proud and disciplined. The colonial soldiers, more modest, formed up on the left, their movements shaped by long practice. The last faint sounds of the departing column had faded from the breeze. Even the final straggler had vanished into the forest. Yet, in front of a large log cabin, one clearly built with more comfort than most, signs of another departure remained. Sentinels paced before the structure, guarding the English general himself. Nearby stood a small group of horses, their saddles and gear revealing much about their riders. Two were clearly prepared for women of high status, an uncommon sight in such remote wilderness. A third horse bore the arms and trappings of a staff officer. The remaining mounts, more plainly equipped and burdened with travel bags, were meant for servants who now waited quietly for their master's command. At a respectful distance, several groups of onlookers had gathered. Some admired the strength and spirit of the military horses. Others simply stared at the scene with dull curiosity. Among them stood one man who clearly did not belong to either group. His expression and movements set him apart. He was neither idle nor ignorant. This man's appearance was strikingly awkward, though not exactly deformed. He had all the usual limbs and joints, but none of the usual proportions. Standing, he towered over others. Yet when seated, he seemed to shrink to average height. His entire body seemed mismatched. A large head sat atop narrow shoulders. His arms hung long and loose, while his hands were surprisingly small and almost delicate. His legs and thighs were so thin they appeared nearly skeletal, yet they were unusually long. His knees were massive, though even they were overshadowed by the broad, flat feet that supported his oddly built frame. His clothing only made matters worse. A sky blue coat with short, wide skirts and a low collar exposed his long, thin neck and even longer legs, drawing attention to his strange form. He wore tight yellow nankeen trousers, tied at the knees with large white ribbons, now faded and worn. His legs were covered in cloudy cotton stockings, and his shoes, one of which bore a plated spur, completed the ensemble. Every curve and angle of his body was on full display, either out of vanity or simple lack of awareness. From beneath the flap of a large, stained vest made of embossed silk and decorated with tarnished silver lace, a peculiar instrument protruded. Its presence among military company gave it the appearance of some mysterious weapon. Though small, this odd device had stirred curiosity among the European soldiers. Yet, several provincial men handled it with ease and familiarity, showing no fear. Atop the figure's head sat a large, formal cocked hat, similar to those worn by clergymen in recent decades. It added a sense of dignity to his kindly but vacant expression, as if the hat itself were needed to uphold the seriousness of some important role. While most kept their distance out of respect for General Webb's quarters, this unusual man walked boldly into the center of the gathered servants. He freely voiced his opinions, praising or criticizing the horses based on how well they met his personal standards. He observed one horse closely and spoke with a voice that was unexpectedly soft and sweet, contrasting sharply with his awkward appearance. He speculated that the animal was not locally bred, but perhaps came from foreign lands, maybe even from the small island across the sea. He claimed experience in such matters, having visited both havens, one at the mouth of the Thames, named after England's capital, and the other called New Haven. He had seen ships gathering livestock for trade with Jamaica. Yet, never before had he seen a horse that so perfectly matched the biblical description of a war horse. He quoted scripture with dramatic flair, describing the animal's strength, its eagerness for battle, and its ability to sense conflict from afar. To him, it seemed as though the lineage of Israel's war horses had survived into the present day. No reply came to his passionate declaration. The man turned toward the silent figure he had unknowingly addressed, only to find a new source of fascination. His gaze landed on the rigid, motionless form of the Indian runner, the same messenger who had delivered grim news the night before. Though surrounded by noise and movement, the native stood in complete stillness, showing no reaction. Yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was a fierce intensity that could catch the eye of even the most seasoned observer. Whatever unexpected remark might have followed the silent exchange between those two unusual men was left unspoken. The white man's curiosity was quickly drawn elsewhere. A stir among the servants and the soft murmur of voices signaled the arrival of those whose presence was needed to begin the journey. The man who had admired the war horse stepped back toward a lean, switch-tailed mare. The animal grazed absent-mindedly on the sparse grass nearby. Resting one elbow on the blanket that passed for saddle, he watched the scene unfold. A foal stood on the other side of the mare, quietly enjoying its morning meal. A young officer, dressed in uniform, approached with two women. Their clothing made it clear they were prepared for the rigors of travel through the forest. One of them, the younger in appearance, though both were youthful, allowed the breeze to lift her green veil. It revealed glimpses of her radiant skin, golden hair, and bright blue eyes. She seemed unaware of the effect, her expression open and unguarded. The soft glow still lingering above the pines in the western sky was no more delicate than the blush on her cheeks. And the warmth of the new day was no more uplifting than the smile she offered the officer as he helped her into the saddle. The other woman, who received equal attention from the young man, kept her features more carefully hidden. Her manner suggested a maturity of several years beyond her companion. Still, her figure, though more developed, shared the same graceful proportions. Her traveling attire did little to conceal her elegance. Once both women were mounted, their escort leapt onto the back of the war horse. The trio turned to General Webb, who stood at the threshold of his cabin, offering a courteous farewell. With a nod, they guided their horses toward the northern edge of the camp. Their attendants followed in silence. As they moved forward, no words passed between them, but a soft gasp escaped the younger woman when the Indian runner suddenly appeared beside her. Without warning, he slipped ahead to lead them along the military road. The older woman made no sound, but the surprise caused her veil to fall open. Her expression revealed a complex mix of emotions: pity, awe, and a trace of fear, as her dark eyes followed the smooth, silent movements of the native. Her hair was black and glossy, like a raven's wing. Her skin was not dark, but rich with a deep, vibrant hue, as if colored by blood just beneath the surface. Yet her face held no harshness. It was refined, symmetrical, and strikingly beautiful. She smiled faintly, perhaps amused by her own momentary lapse. The smile revealed a set of teeth so white they rivaled polished ivory. Then, with quiet grace, she lowered her veil once more, bowed her head, and continued riding in silence, lost in thoughts far removed from the world around her. While one of the young women remained quietly absorbed in her thoughts, the other quickly recovered from her earlier alarm. Laughing at her own reaction, she turned to the officer riding beside her. Her tone was playful, yet edged with curiosity. She wondered aloud whether such ghostly figures were common in the woods, or if this particular sight had been arranged for their amusement. If it was the latter, she joked, then gratitude should silence their doubts. But if it was the former, she and her companion would need to summon all the ancestral courage they claimed to possess, especially before facing the formidable Montcalm. The officer responded calmly. He explained that the Indian was a runner for the army, and by the standards of his people, could be considered a hero. The native had volunteered to guide them to the lake using a little-known path. It would be quicker and more pleasant than following the slow-moving column. The young woman shuddered, her fear partly feigned but mostly sincere. She admitted her unease and questioned whether the officer truly knew the man, or if he was placing too much trust in a stranger. The officer reassured her. He clarified that it wasn't himself he was trusting. It was her safety he was most concerned about. He did know the guide, and would not have placed confidence in him otherwise, especially now. Though the man was said to be Canadian, he had served alongside the Mohawks, allies of the British. His connection to their group had come through a strange incident involving her father, during which the native had been treated harshly. The officer dismissed the details as unimportant, emphasizing only that the man was now their ally. The girl's concern deepened. If the guide had once been her father's enemy, she liked him even less. She asked the officer to speak to the man, hoping to hear his voice. She confessed her belief in the power of vocal tones to reveal character, a sentiment she had shared before. The officer declined. He explained that speaking would likely be met with silence or a brief grunt. Though the guide might understand English, he pretended not to, like many of his people. Especially now, with war at hand, he would be unlikely to break that silence. Just then, the guide stopped. It was clear they had reached the entrance to the hidden path. The officer's guess proved correct. The Indian pointed toward a narrow trail, cutting through the thicket beside the road. It was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and nearly invisible to the untrained eye. The officer spoke quietly, urging calm. He warned that showing distrust could invite the very danger they feared. The younger woman hesitated and turned to her companion. She asked whether traveling with the troops, though perhaps uncomfortable, might offer greater safety. Heyward responded with measured confidence. He explained that her lack of experience with native tactics had led to a misunderstanding. If enemies were present at all, a doubtful possibility, given the scouts, they would likely target the main column, where more scalps could be taken. The detachment's route was known, but theirs had only just been decided and remained secret. Cora, the older of the two, spoke with quiet conviction. She questioned whether they should judge the guide simply because his ways were different and his skin was dark. Alice no longer hesitated. With a sharp flick of her whip, she urged her Narragansett forward, brushing aside the thin branches and plunging into the tangled path behind the Indian runner. The young officer watched her with open admiration. Though Alice was fairer in complexion, he allowed her to ride ahead alone, choosing instead to clear the way for Cora, whose presence seemed to command his deeper attention. It appeared the servants had been given prior instructions. Rather than entering the thicket, they followed the main column. Heyward explained that this decision came from the guide's foresight. By separating their path, They would leave fewer signs for any Canadian savages who might be scouting ahead of their forces. For a while, the dense and winding trail made conversation impossible. Eventually, they broke through the thick underbrush lining the highway and entered the towering, shadowy arches of the forest. Their movement became smoother. As soon as the guide saw that the women could manage their horses, he increased the pace. It was a steady rhythm, faster than a walk, slower than a full trot, perfect for the unique, sure-footed animals they rode. Heyward turned to speak to Kura, her dark eyes drawing his attention. But before he could say a word, the distant sound of hooves echoed behind them. The horses clattered over the uneven ground, prompting him to halt. His companions instinctively pulled their reins as well. The entire group stopped, waiting to understand the cause of this unexpected interruption. Within moments, a colt darted through the pine trees, moving with the grace of a fallow deer. Right behind it came the ungainly man previously described, riding with all the speed his thin and reluctant mare could tolerate without protest. Until now, this peculiar figure had gone unnoticed by the travelers. If his towering presence on foot had the power to draw attention, his awkward riding style was even more likely to do so. Despite his persistent use of a single heel to urge the mare forward, the best pace he could manage was a lopsided gallop. The hind legs moved with enthusiasm, while the front legs contributed only occasionally, preferring a lazy trot. The frequent shifts between these uneven gaits may have created an illusion of speed. Even Heyward, with his trained eye for horses, couldn't determine exactly how the rider managed to keep up with such determined effort. The rider's own movements were just as unusual as those of his horse. With each shift in the mare's stride, he rose in the stirrups, stretching his long legs in exaggerated motions. This caused his height to appear to grow and shrink unpredictably, making it impossible to guess his true size. Adding to the spectacle, his uneven use of the spur caused one side of the mare to move faster than the other. The horse's discomfort was made clear by the constant swishing of her bushy tail, which flicked with irritation at every stride. Together, horse and rider formed a picture of comic determination, an image both strange and unforgettable. The stern expression that had settled on Heyward's open and handsome face began to soften. A faint smile touched his lips as he observed the stranger. Alice made little effort to hide her amusement, and even Cora's thoughtful eyes sparkled with a hint of humor, though her restraint seemed more habitual than natural. Heyward addressed the newcomer once he had slowed his pace. He asked whether the man was seeking someone and hoped he wasn't bringing bad news. The stranger, busy waving his triangular hat to stir the still forest air, gave a vague reply. It was unclear which question he had answered. After cooling his face and catching his breath, he explained that he was also headed to Fort William Henry. Believing that good company would benefit both sides, he had decided to join them. Heyward responded with mild sarcasm. He pointed out that the stranger had made the decision alone, despite being outnumbered. The man agreed, stating that the first step was knowing one's own mind, a task not easily achieved when women were involved. Once decided, he believed in acting on it. That, he said, was why he was here. Heyward, growing more formal, informed him that he had taken the wrong path. The main road to the lake lay half a mile behind. The stranger, unfazed, replied that he had spent a week at Fort Edward and had certainly asked for directions. If he hadn't, he joked, his profession would be in question. He added that it wasn't wise for someone in his line of work to be too familiar with those he was meant to instruct. That was why he avoided the army's route. He also assumed that Heyward, being a gentleman, had chosen the best path. So, he had decided to follow, hoping for pleasant company and meaningful conversation. Heyward, torn between irritation and laughter, asked about this profession. Was the man a military instructor, or perhaps a mathematician drawing lines and angles? The stranger looked puzzled, then adopted a humble tone. He assured them he meant no offense and had committed no sin since last seeking forgiveness. He didn't understand the references to angles or teaching. His only claim was a modest talent for singing psalms and offering thanks through sacred music. Alice, clearly entertained, declared him a disciple of Apollo and claimed him under her protection. She urged Heyward to set aside his frown and allow the man to travel with them. In a quieter tone, she suggested that he might prove useful if danger arose. Heyward replied that he wouldn't have chosen this secret path if he expected such danger. Alice dismissed the concern for now, saying the stranger amused her. If he truly had music in his soul, she didn't want to reject his company. She pointed down the path with her riding whip, and their eyes met in a lingering glance. Heyward, swayed by her gentle influence, spurred his horse forward and rejoined Cora. Alice waved to the stranger, inviting him to follow. She joked that her relatives believed she had some talent for duets and hoped to learn from a master. The man responded eagerly. He agreed that singing psalms was refreshing for both body and spirit, but he noted that true harmony required 4 parts. Alice, he said, clearly had a soft and rich treble. He could manage a strong tenor, but they lacked counter and bass. He suggested that Heyward, based on his speaking voice, might fill the bass role. Alice smiled and cautioned against quick judgments. Though Heyward could produce deep tones, his natural voice was better suited to tenor. The stranger asked if Heyward was skilled in psalmody. Alice, suppressing a laugh, replied that he leaned more towards secular songs. A soldier's life, she said, didn't encourage solemn music. The man nodded solemnly. He believed that every voice was a gift to be used wisely. He was proud that, despite his musical upbringing, no crude verse had ever passed his lips. Alice asked if he sang only sacred songs. He confirmed this. To him, the Psalms of David surpassed all other language. The version used in New England, he claimed, was richer and more exact than any other. He always kept a copy close, whether awake or asleep. It was the 26th edition, printed in Boston in 1744, titled The Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs of the Old and New Testaments, faithfully translated into English meter for the use, edification, and comfort of the saints in public and private, especially in New England. During his praise of the rare works produced by the poets of his homeland, the stranger reached into his pocket and carefully drew out a small book. He adjusted a pair of iron-rimmed spectacles on his nose and opened the volume with a reverence that suggested he considered it sacred. Without any introduction or apology, he uttered the word Standish, as if signaling the beginning of something solemn. Then, raising the strange device he carried to his lips, he produced a high, sharp note, immediately followed by a lower tone from his own voice. In that instant, he began to sing. His voice, full and melodious, seemed to defy the awkward movements of his ill-trained horse. The hymn he sang spoke of the goodness of unity, of the harmony that comes when brothers dwell together in peace. The words likened that fellowship to the sacred oil poured upon Aaron, flowing from his head down to the hem of his garments, a symbol of blessing, grace, and divine favor. Though the man appeared ungainly and his movements were irregular, the song carried a serene dignity. Each note was steady and expressive, filling the surrounding air with the quiet power of faith. Even the restless animal he rode seemed to adjust to the cadence of his voice, as if the song itself could still the world around him. In that moment, the forest, the man, and his horse seemed to merge into a single scene of devotion and quiet reverence, the hymn lingering in the air long after the last note had faded. As the stranger delivered his rhythmic verses, his right hand moved in a practiced rise and fall. At each descent, his fingers lingered briefly on the pages of his small book. On the upward motion, he added a flourish so elaborate that only those deeply trained in the art could hope to replicate it. This gesture seemed essential to his performance, continuing until the final word of the verse, delivered with deliberate emphasis, brought the chant to a close. Such a disruption to the quiet of the forest naturally caught the attention of those riding just ahead. The Indian guide muttered a few words in broken English to Heyward, prompting the officer to address the stranger directly. With a firm but courteous tone, he interrupted the singing and requested a pause in the musical display. Though he assured them there was no immediate danger, Heyward explained that caution demanded a quieter approach through the wilderness. He apologized to Alice for curbing her amusement, asking her to accept the delay in the stranger's performance until a safer moment. Alice responded with playful sarcasm. She claimed her enjoyment had indeed been interrupted, not by the stranger's singing, but by Heyward's own deep voice, which had broken her thoughtful analysis of the mismatch between the music and its meaning. Heyward, slightly offended, replied that he didn't know what she meant by bass, but he did know that her safety and Cora's mattered more to him than any grand orchestra. As he spoke, he suddenly turned his head toward a nearby thicket, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He glanced at their guide, who continued forward with calm and steady steps. Heyward smiled to himself, thinking he had simply mistaken a bright forest berry for the eyes of a hidden enemy. He resumed his ride, picking up the conversation where it had paused. But Heyward's confidence was misplaced. His youthful pride had dulled his vigilance. Not long after the group passed, the bushes in the thicket shifted quietly. A face emerged, wild and fierce, shaped by savage art and untamed emotion. The painted features glowed with a dark intensity as the figure watched the travelers disappear into the forest. A flash of triumph lit his expression. He followed their path with his eyes, tracking the graceful movements of the women as they rode through the winding trail. Heyward's strong form followed close behind. The singing master's awkward silhouette lingered for a moment. Then, at last, he vanished among the countless tree trunks. Those trunks stood like silent sentinels in the woods. As Heyward and his trusting companions ventured deeper into the forest, unaware of the dangers that lurked among its shadows, the scene shifted westward, a few miles from their path. There, on the banks of a swift-moving stream, two men lingered. Their posture suggested they were waiting, either for someone to arrive or for an anticipated event to unfold. The forest stretched wide, its canopy reaching the river's edge. Branches hung low, casting deep shadows over the dark current. The sun's intensity had begun to fade, and the heat of the day softened as cool vapors rose from hidden springs and settled into the air. A heavy stillness blanketed the area, typical of a sultry July afternoon in the American wilderness. Only faint sounds broke the quiet. The low murmur of the men's voices, the lazy tapping of a woodpecker, the harsh cry of a brightly colored jay, and the distant, muffled roar of a waterfall. These scattered noises were familiar to the forest dwellers and did little to distract them from their conversation. One of the men bore the red skin and wild attire of a native warrior. The other, though dressed in rough and nearly savage gear, revealed a sun-darkened face and long features that hinted at European ancestry. The native sat at the end of a moss-covered log, his posture calm yet expressive. His gestures added weight to his words, reflecting the composed intensity of an Indian engaged in serious debate. His body, nearly bare, displayed a fearsome symbol of death, painted in stark patterns of white and black. His head was shaved clean, save for the traditional scalping tuft that marked his warrior status. No other decoration adorned him, except a single eagle feather that crossed his crown and hung over his left shoulder. A tomahawk and scalping knife, both of English make, rested in his belt. A short military rifle, the kind often given to native allies by colonial forces, lay casually across his strong, bare knee. His broad chest, well-formed limbs, and solemn face showed a man in the prime of life. There were no signs of age or weakness, only the quiet strength of one who had reached full maturity. The white man's frame, as revealed by the parts not hidden beneath his clothing, spoke of a life shaped by hardship and constant exertion. Though lean rather than broad, his body was muscular and hardened, each sinew and fiber toughened by years of exposure and toil. He wore a forest green hunting shirt, its faded yellow fringe hinting at long use. His summer cap, made from animal skins stripped of their fur, sat low on his head. A knife rested in a wampum belt similar to the one that held the Indian's garments, though he carried no tomahawk. His moccasins were decorated in the bright style of native craftsmanship. Beneath his hunting shirt, only a pair of buckskin leggings was visible. They laced along the sides and were tied above the knees with deer sinew. A pouch and powder horn completed his gear. Nearby, leaning against a sapling, stood a long rifle, one considered by skilled white hunters to be the most formidable of firearms. His eyes were small, sharp, and constantly in motion. They scanned the surroundings with the restless energy of a man always alert, whether searching for game or wary of ambush. Despite this habitual suspicion, his face carried no deceit. At the moment he appeared, it was marked by a rugged honesty. Speaking in the native tongue once common between the Hudson and the Potomac, he addressed his companion. His words, translated freely for clarity, retained a unique rhythm and tone of both speaker and language. He argued that both their peoples had taken land by force, his ancestors crossing the ocean from the east and Chingachgook from the west. He suggested that judgment be left to God and that friends should not quarrel over history. Chingachgook responded with quiet intensity. His voice was firm as he pointed out a key difference. His ancestors had fought with stone-tipped arrows, while the white man's people used deadly bullets. The scout nodded, acknowledging the fairness of the point. He admitted that the Indian's reasoning was sound, even if nature had given him a different skin. For a moment, he seemed to concede the argument. Then, gathering his thoughts, he offered a counterpoint. He wasn't a scholar, he said, but from his experience in hunting, he believed that a rifle in the hands of early settlers was no more dangerous than a well-aimed arrow from an Indian bow. Chingachgook remained unmoved. He gestured dismissively and asked what the white elders told their youth. Did they speak of meeting painted warriors armed only with stone hatchets and wooden guns? The scout replied with measured honesty. He didn't boast of his heritage, though even his worst enemy, an Iroquois, would not deny his white identity. He admitted that his people had many customs he couldn't defend. One such habit was writing history in books rather than sharing it in village gatherings. In those settings, lies could be challenged face to face, and brave men could call on witnesses to confirm a truth. Because of this written tradition, he explained, a man who avoided idle learning might never know his ancestors' deeds. Still, he believed the Bumpos had been skilled marksmen. His own talent with a rifle felt inherited, passed down like any gift, good or bad, as taught in sacred commandments. But he didn't presume to speak for others. He concluded by inviting Chingachgook to share the native account. What, he asked, did the red men say happened when their ancestors first met the pale faces? A moment of silence passed. The Indian sat still, his posture dignified and his expression solemn. Then, with the weight of tradition behind him, he began his tale. His voice carried the gravity of truth, passed down through generations. He asked Hawkeye to listen closely, promising no lies. What he shared was the legacy of his people, the story of the Mohicans. He paused briefly, casting a cautious glance at his companion, then continued with a mix of question and statement. He pointed to the stream before them, asking whether its waters flowed toward the summer until they turned salty and reversed their course. Hawkeye confirmed the tradition. He had seen himself. Though he admitted he couldn't explain why sweet water became bitter in the sun, he acknowledged the truth of the observation. The Indian pressed further, seeking confirmation of the current's reversal. Hawkeye assured him that the elders had spoken true. He explained the phenomenon as the tide, 6 hours in, 6 hours out, driven by the difference in water levels between the sea and the river. The Indian responded with quiet wisdom. He described how the waters of the woods and lakes flowed downward until they lay still, like his outstretched hand. Hawkeye agreed, though he felt the need to defend his explanation. He argued that scale mattered. On a small scale, the earth seemed flat, but on a large scale it was round. That difference, he claimed, explained why vast bodies of water like the sea could never be still. Though the Indian may not have accepted this reasoning, he remained composed. Without showing disbelief, he resumed his story with the same solemn tone. His people had come from the west, crossing great plains filled with buffalo. They reached the Big River and fought the Allegheny until the land was soaked in blood. From there to the Salt Lake, no one stood in their way. The Maquas followed from a distance. The Mohicans claimed the land from the point where the streams ceased to flow upward, stretching 20 suns' journey to the south. They drove the Maquas into the woods, where they lived among bears. The Mohicans took the fish, the Maquas got only bones. Hawkeye acknowledged the tale, noting that it occurred long before the English arrived. The Indian agreed. A pine once stood where a chestnut now grew. The first pale faces spoke no English. They came in a large canoe after the Mohicans had made peace with neighboring tribes. In those days, they were one people, happy and united. The Salt Lake gave them fish, the woods gave deer, and the air gave birds. They married, raised children, worshipped the Great Spirit, and kept the Maquas far from their songs of victory. Hawkeye asked about the Indians' own family from that time. He praised Chingachgook's character and assumed his ancestors were brave and wise. The Indian confirmed it. His tribe was ancient, and he was pure-blooded. Chief's blood ran through his veins. But then the Dutch arrived, bringing firewater. His people drank until they believed they had found the Great Spirit. They gave up their land, piece by piece. Now, as a chief in Sagamore, he had never seen the sun shine outside the forest, nor visited his ancestors' graves. The scout, moved by this quiet sorrow, reflected on the solemn power of graves. He admitted he might never be buried, his bones left to bleach in the woods or be scattered by wolves. He asked where the rest of Chingachgook's people had gone, those who had once joined the Delawares. The Indian answered with a poetic sadness. Like summer blossoms, they had fallen one by one. Each had departed for the land of spirits. He stood now on the hilltop, ready to descend into the valley. When Uncas followed, the bloodline of the Sagamores would end. His son was the last of the Mohicans. A quiet voice responded nearby. In the same soft, musical tone, it said, "Uncas is here." Who speaks to Uncas? At the sudden sound, the white man instinctively loosened the knife in his sheath and reached toward his rifle. But the Indian remained perfectly still, showing no reaction to the unexpected interruption. A moment later, a young warrior stepped silently between them and sat beside the rushing stream. No words were exchanged. Neither father nor son spoke, nor did they show surprise. They waited, each respecting the other's dignity, avoiding any sign of impatience or curiosity. The white man, observing their quiet strength, released his grip on the rifle and followed their example, remaining silent. Eventually, Chingachgook turned his gaze toward the newcomer and asked calmly whether the Maquas had dared to leave tracks in the forest. The young warrior replied that he had followed their trail. There were 10 of them, he said, no more than the fingers on both hands. But they were hiding, unwilling to face their enemies openly. Hawkeye the scout spoke next. He called the Maquas thieves, lying in wait for scalps and loot. He suspected that Montcalm, the the cunning French commander, had sent spies deep into their territory. But he was confident the enemy would soon learn which path they had chosen. Chingachgook glanced toward the setting sun. That was all he needed to hear. Tomorrow, he said, they would drive the Maquas from their hiding places like frightened deer. Tonight, they would eat. Hawkeye agreed. He was ready for both battle and supper. But he reminded them that to fight, they first had to find the enemy. And to eat, they needed to hunt. Just then, as if summoned by their words, movement stirred in the bushes below the hill. A pair of massive antlers shifted through the leaves. Hawkeye's eyes lit up. He whispered to Uncas, laughing quietly like a man trained to be alert. He wagered his horse, filled 3 times with powder, against a foot of wampum that he could hit the buck squarely between the eyes, closer to the right than the left. Uncas leapt to his feet, eager and excited. He protested that only the tips of the antlers were visible. Hawkeye shook his head and spoke to Chingachgook. The boy, he said, still had much to learn. A true hunter could see part of a creature and know exactly where the rest of it lay. He raised his rifle, preparing to prove his skill. But Chingachgook reached out and gently pushed the weapon aside. He asked one simple question. Would Hawkeye fight the Maquas? The scout paused. He lowered the rifle and turned away, humbled. These Indians, he said, understood the forest as if by instinct. He would leave the deer to Uncas and his arrow. Better that than to kill a buck only for the Iroquois to feast on it. As soon as Chingachgook gave a subtle gesture of approval, Uncas dropped to the ground and crept forward with quiet precision. He moved cautiously, nearing the cover where the buck stood hidden. Within a few yards, he carefully fitted an arrow to his bow. The antlers shifted slightly, as if the animal sensed danger in the air. Then came the sharp twang of the bowstring. A white streak flashed through the bushes, and the wounded buck burst from its hiding place, charging straight toward Uncas. With swift reflexes, Uncas dodged the deadly antlers and struck. His knife swept across the animal's throat, and the buck bounded toward the river's edge before collapsing, staining the water with its blood. Hawkeye watched with quiet satisfaction. He chuckled to himself and praised the skill of the kill. It was a fine sight, he said, though an arrow alone wasn't enough. It always needed a knife to finish the job. Chingachgook suddenly turned, alert as a hound catching a scent. Hawkeye's eyes lit up with excitement. He spotted movement and declared that a whole herd might be nearby. If they came within range, he vowed to take one down, even if the entire 6 nations were listening. He asked Chingachgook what he heard, for to his own ears, the forest was silent. The Indian bent low, pressing his ear close to the earth. He listened intently, then rose with quiet certainty. There was no herd, he said. The deer was dead, but he heard footsteps. Hawkeye guessed it might be wolves, following the wounded buck's trail. Chingachgook disagreed. He recognized the sound of horses. White men were approaching. With calm authority, he resumed his seat and told Hawkeye to speak to his brothers. Hawkeye agreed, promising to use English fit for a king. But he remained puzzled. He saw nothing and heard no one. It was strange, he said, that an Indian could detect the sounds of white men better than someone like himself, whose blood was purely white, even if his life among natives had made others question it. Just then he heard it, a dry stick cracking, bushes rustling, and a faint trampling sound. At first, he had mistaken it for the distant roar of the falls. But now it was clear. They were coming. He whispered a prayer for their safety, hoping they wouldn't fall into the hands of the Iroquois. Hawkeye's hand hovered over his weapon. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made his pulse quicken. Uncas and Chingachgook exchanged a knowing glance, the kind only those accustomed to the wild could understand. The forest itself seemed to pause, holding its breath with them. Shadows shifted among the trunks, but the source remained unseen. Every second stretched longer than the last, each heartbeat a reminder that danger could emerge at any moment. Then, slowly, the forest sounds faded into tense silence, leaving them waiting, alert, silent, and ready for whatever came next. As Uncas and Chingachgook paused, listening to the approaching footsteps, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The rustle of leaves, the crack of distant branches, every sound carried the weight of uncertainty. Hawkeye's eyes scanned the shadows, heart steady but mind alert. Who approached through the trees? Friend or foe? The answer lay just beyond the next ridge, and for now, all they could do was wait. If you're enjoying this journey through the wilderness, consider supporting the channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions help us bring more stories to life every day. Join us in the next episode, where danger draws nearer and the fate of our travelers begins to unfold. Every step, every sound, every heartbeat matters in this wilderness of suspense.